For today's history video, I'd like to explore the question of why the Cold War started and why it got off to such intensity that it dominated politics globally for the next 40 years. Henry Kissinger, in the book he wrote 20 years ago, Diplomacy, which I recently reread and would suggest you do too, makes the point that there was a completely serious intellectual disconnect between the West and Stalin, who was running Russia at the time, in 1945. The West thought that the fight against Hitler and against Japan was a sort of Wilsonian Crusade, stemming from Woodrow Wilson's idea that the rule of law should dominate the world, and that consent of the governed and democracy should triumph. Whereas for Russia, it wasn't any of that. It was just that the Germans attacked them, and they threw them out, and it was a national conflict between the Germans and the Russians. And when the war ended, the Western allies, led then by Truman after FDR died, and Churchill, and more importantly, the American and the European people, believed that now there would be a real rule of law in the world, the UN would enforce it, and there would be a good faith effort to really create a harmony in the planet. Stalin's attitude was, I've just lost 20 million people in the war, I damn near lost it, and I'm going to dismember Germany, castrate it in every way I can, and take control of as much of Eastern Europe as I can so that I have a buffer zone to protect Russia in the future. And my national interest is what's important. Ideology and rule of law and all that stuff, I don't even understand what they're talking about. Then, when Stalin was aggressive in acting out his policies by seizing Eastern Europe, blocking free elections in Poland, separating Germany into East and West, launching the war in Korea through the North Korean satellite that he controlled, the West was strong and firm and aggressive in its response, led really by Harry Truman and George Marshall, and it was Secretary of State. And NATO was formed. We fought back in Korea and stopped the communist takeover. We gave aid to Greece and beat the communists in the civil war there. And we fortified West Germany and made it a very strong answer to Soviet intrusion. And Stalin sat back around 1950, right before his death, and according to Kissinger, said, I didn't expect this. I didn't expect that the Western democracies would be tough and strong. I thought they'd just roll over and play dead like they did against Hitler in the Munich period. And when he saw the Americans and the British and the Europeans aggressively fighting back the Marshall Plan, putting Europe on its feet, he sent out feelers to the United States saying he would like a negotiation. And his concept was that there would be a deal. There would be two spheres of influence, the West and the East, and they'd more or less leave each other alone. And Stalin couldn't understand why the West wouldn't make that deal. The West would have been willing to make that deal earlier when they believed in Stalin's good faith. But they had become so convinced of Russia's mendacity and Stalin's untruthfulness, and that you couldn't deal with him because he would never keep his word, because he'd broken it all along, that the West wouldn't play ball, and the Cold War was on, and it became a long-term, permanent competition. The West never understood why Stalin at the beginning wouldn't obey the rule of law and keep its word, and Stalin never understood, as his death approached, why the West was going to continue the confrontation and wasn't willing to cut a deal. Very interesting perspective. And then, of course, Stalin died in 1951, I think, or 52, and the leaders that followed him weren't strong enough to ever orchestrate those negotiations, and the Cold War continued till it destroyed Russia 40 years later. It's an interesting theory. Thanks for watching.